and thank you all for being here. It's my great honor and pleasure to be here with you this evening giving the 11th Attallah lecture at the Communications and Media Studies program of Carleton University. In honoring Professor Attallah's memory, Professor, now retired I understand, Michael Dorland, has written that for Attallah, the central relationship between media and society was not primarily economic, but, as Ira also just mentioned, fundamentally a moral or ethical one, mediated by images, but at the same time bounded by the various rationalities at play in modernity. It is this claim that I would like to ground my argument on. For like him, I too believe that the relationship between media images and us, audiences, is fundamentally ethical. As critical scholars of communication and journalism, then, our intellectual task, I believe, is to highlight this ethical core at the heart of our relationship to media, even when, or especially when, this relationship manifests itself as an economic one. So my lecture today addresses this task, and I focus on a particular kind of media images, user-generated content from crisis and conflict zones. Specifically, I reflect on the ways in which such images and news stories are contextualized and used in Western journalism. I do not look at specific texts, however. Rather, in the spirit of Paul Attallah, I ask the question, what kinds of rationalities, as he put it, drive that work of contextualization? What are the frameworks within which it is possible to think of, speak about, and manage such user-generated content, as we call it, in academic, but also professional and public discourse? How do we think about user-generated content, about mobile phone footage from crisis and conflict zones? That's the first question. And the second question that I want to ask, not yet, is what are the implications then of such rationalities for crisis and war reporting? How do these rationalities shape our understanding of what migration is? How do these rationalities shape our understanding of what conflict is? Can we, in other words, user-generated content, in other words, really make a difference in the ways we engage with conflicts and crises as relatively safe, relatively affluent citizens of the Western world? Before I continue, however, let us watch an example of what I call user-generated content to get a taste of what kind of footage I'm talking about. So here is the piece of news from the BBC. It appeared in March 2016, and I've taken it from a project on media and migration that I co-led at LSE from 2015 until 2017. But there are plenty of others in the media, both before and after, and I'm sure you have encountered a lot of them as newsreaders and as social media users on your mobile phones. Can we play the clip, please? Yes, thank you.
صوروهم مسئول جلشون بسیار اصلا برنگرد فیلم ان شاء الله يا رب خلاص راحوا
So Turkish guards hit migrant boat with sticks. And this is what the migrants filmed from their dinghy as they were experiencing that event. I'm going to be coming back to that example several times during my talk. But for now, let us just focus on this particular synergy that we can see here between this amateur, chaotic, and dramatic footage and its uptake and redissemination by a global broadcaster as a piece of news. This synergy, then, between that film and the BBC takes us straight into the question of rationalities that I mentioned just before and that I want us to reflect on. Specifically, this clip exemplifies the first major rationality of user-generated content, which we can call the techno-institutional rationality of convergence, the rationality of convergence. So here are the questions, and here are the rationalities, right? The rationality of convergence celebrates sharing and connectivity through digital platforms. It celebrates the fact that we may sit at home and watch on our phone screen the footage of an illegal crossing filmed on another phone by a refugee sailing through the Mediterranean. But there is a second rationality through which we can understand and we can speak about user-generated content. And this is what I call the ethico-political process of witnessing. Instead of focusing on user-generated content as citizen acts of content sharing, I film, upload, and others disseminate, this rationality approaches user-generated content as citizen acts of bearing witness in contexts of life and death. So as opposed to convergence, which foregrounds technological capacity, witnessing highlights human precarity, the openness to violence and death of bodies living under conditions of crisis and conflict. This is not a dominant rationality, even though occasionally it does surface in public debate. For example, in the imagery of Alan Kurdi in September 2015. I don't need to tell you now that his family ended up and is now living in Canada. But this was the imagery of the Syrian toddler photographed lying on the beach of Turkey, lifeless, which went viral upon its publication in Western news media, as I said, September the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. It was one of the most viral stories of 2015. So my key message in this lecture, and I'm saying it up front here, is that we must take the nature of user-generated content as witnessing much more seriously than we do now. And taking this kind of footage as testimony of lives who are at risk is really an argument about recovering the historicity of this digital content. For before these became images for us to consume, they were bodies, often bodies, not always, but often bodies risking their lives as they are filming their precarity for us to see, for the world to see. So that's the key point I'm making. Where are the bodies in user-generated content and in the dominant framework, rationality of convergence? Ignoring this historical trajectory, I'm arguing towards the end of the lecture, empties user-generated content of its moral urgency. And this, as I'm going to argue, has costs. But first things first. Before we get to the costs, let me briefly elaborate on what convergence actually means, what are the debates around it, and then move on to talk about witnessing in a similar way. And I ask for your patience, as I will, at times, inevitably be iterating claims that are familiar to us all. So let me start with convergence. Convergence relies on the technological compatibility between Web 2.0 and various platforms that make it possible for content to be remediated instantaneously from one platform to another, from the mobile phone to Twitter to the BBC website and back to social media. And it is precisely this remediation that has been hailed as the single most important digital development in news journalism. For it blurs the boundary of professional reporting and integrates non-professionals within the practices of institutional newsmaking. From a convergence perspective, then, this video is what Melissa Wall and Sahar Zahed call the collaborative news clip, a piece of video recording that found its way onto BBC through intermediary social media platforms. Today, as the authors say, much of the reporting of conflict that appears in the international news media has fallen to amateurs, often activists within the conflict itself. Early accounts of convergence have been positive. This integration of user-generated content in institutional news was seen as a positive development that helped the democratization of journalism, giving voice to people and changing the authority relations between professionals and users. Axel Brun, for instance, was one of the first back in 2007 who hailed the emergence of producers and regarded digital media as a new form of participatory content creation within the new, what he called, networked commons. Adrian Russell similarly talked about audiences moving from the periphery to the center of news production. And former head of BBC World, now Professor Richard Sandberg, described journalism today as a collaborative project where citizens contribute to the making of the news just as journalists do. In my work, I have described this paradigm as a shift from a journalism of reporting, where professionals offer an impartial overview of a crisis or a conflict, to a journalism of digital witnessing, where citizens immersed in events as they happen offer their own partial and often deeply emotional account of events. Finally, Mette Mortensen refers to eyewitness news images as ushering a new era of conflict reporting. And she has more recently talked about connective witnessing to capture this new productive synergy of professionals with protest activists on the ground. However, in the past 2 or 3 years, things have changed. The turning point for this change has been the 2016 revelations that malevolent actors, individual or state, are populating, or to be more precise, contaminating platforms with so-called ordinary voices that actually manipulate online traffic to achieve specific political ends. This has resulted, as again we all know, in a change of mood. Today, then, research in the paradigm of convergence concentrates on disinformation, one of the greatest buzzwords of our time. And criticism for disinformation is directed both at news organizations themselves for compromising truth for profit, and at social media platforms whose business models privilege virality over credibility. Alice Marek and Rebecca Lewis's recent report on disinformation, for instance, refers to news media saying that their dependence on social media analytics and metrics and on clickbait makes them vulnerable to media manipulation. Making a much bolder point, Pablo Boskovsky and Eugenia Michelstein, in their book The News Gap, state that convergent journalism has little to do with democracy. It is basically a market choice for major news networks. Journalists, they continue, want to maximize their viewership and revenue, and this is why they are constantly, and I'm quoting here, are constantly involved in the business of monitoring, reproducing, and imitating citizen content. It is true that the dominance of a profit-driven model, clickbaiting, and the proliferation of non-institutional sources, from trolls to terrorists, has created the perfect storm for journalism. It has nurtured a milieu of content remediation where the spread of rumor and fake news blurs the boundary between fact and fiction. And so, as so many commentators and academics have noticed, it undermines citizen trust, public conversation, and the democratic process itself. The rationality of convergence, then, is under intense scrutiny. And this scrutiny inevitably spills over discussions that go beyond our own democracies and encompass debates on how reporting takes place in faraway places, conflict zones or crisis zones, which of course overlap with and impact our own liberal public spheres. So there are specifically three critical arguments on convergence in crisis and conflict zones that deserve our attention. And I'm going to sum it up and then finish with my account of how the rationality of convergence is thought of, debated, and managed in the academic disciplines and in public debate. The first critique is the critique of political economy of platforms, so largely what I have just described in terms of the clickbaiting and the profit-oriented management of user-generated content by news platforms. But in the context of conflict reporting in particular, it is worth mentioning, for instance, the study by Tarleton Gillespie, who criticizes YouTube on how it helped ISIS circulate its beheading videos among its 1.8 billion users, and so turned its platform into a very effective propaganda campaign because of the kind of algorithmic regulation of the circulation of videos. So ISIS videos, in a way, became part of a snowball effect. So more and more people were watching it. So that's one of the critiques of convergence when it comes to the political economy of platforms in relation to conflict and crisis reporting. A second point, critical point here, are general anxieties around technological progress. For instance, the fact that new technology are always a step ahead, always outpace our own institutional verification skills, that we cannot outsmart machines when it comes to discovering what's true behind the claim that we see online. Robert Chesney, for example, warns of the consequences of using deep fakes in the age of what he calls post-truth geopolitics. As hard to detect AI-generated images, deepfakes, he argues, spread readily across different public spheres in the Arab world and beyond, they can very easily incite further violence and perpetuate cycles of animosity. The third point that is being part of the critical discussions on the rationality of convergence in relation to user-generated content, is really the techno-solutionist argument. That is the argument that basically says, okay, we've got a problem with technology, but we can solve that problem with technology. So it's a techno-solutionist argument that relies on AI, on artificial intelligence, or algorithmically driven programs to detect fake news and address disinformation simply through this kind of automated detection systems. A recent work, for instance, highlights a Ukrainian fact-checking app called Stop Fake that monitors Russian-driven propaganda in Ukraine and flags trolls and fake news. And there's a lot of that work that happens not only in academia, but also beyond that, and we read about that in press publications and television and social media. So while there is no doubt then that this triple debate on disinformation constitutes a vital agenda for liberal democracies based on truthful journalism and informed deliberation among citizens. I would like us to pause here, because I'm not interested in continuing that discussion. That discussion is taking place. It is important, and we're all involved in it. We all know it. But I would like to pause, and I would like to ask a different set of questions to the ones that we have just explored. Questions that take us straight to the ethico-political paradigm or rationality of user-generated content I mentioned in the beginning. If we go back to the migrant video that we watched, there are a couple of legitimate questions that we can ask, but we do not usually ask. What about those people on the boat? Isn't it their content our media is using? Where are they in the rationality of convergence? Should they not figure in our discussions about the news they generate in any way? These are equally important questions, I argue, for our liberal democracies as informed citizenship and truthful information are. Because, as Luc Boltanski argues, the political communities of Western modernity, our communities, are not only founded on the kind of nation-based principle of a well-functioning democracy, but also on the outward-looking principle of care for others, the poor, the vulnerable, the suffering, beyond our nation-states. Put otherwise, the rationalities of humanitarianism and human rights that are flagship policies for many of those liberal democracies that we have in mind are integral to the ways in which we live, think, and act in and with our media, just as much as the deliberative public sphere is, and the need for truthful information. So why do we not ask those questions? Perhaps the terminology we are using has something to do with it. Maybe the problem, at least partly, lies with the very acronym user-generated content. I mean, the jargon is UGC, right? Everybody's talking about UGC. User-generated content brings forth a new conception of the audience of the news in particular, as a user, a producer, as I said earlier. But it also hides something important. Something that in the context of conflict and crisis reporting is more than important. It is existential. The term UGC hides the bodies of those who do the recording under conditions of risk to life. A film like our opening one is not just UGC. It is the use of mobile phone as testimonial technology. A technology that bears witness to the precariousness of those bodies as they are attacked mid-sea. In my book, Witnessing Without Responsibility, I introduced the term flesh witnessing to refer to this practice of digital vision associated with a mobile phone. I argue that flesh witnessing consists of embodied and mobile testimonies of distant suffering that reach Western news publics as potential causes of our emotion, reflection, and action. The term flesh witnessing is not mine. It was first used by Yuval Harari in 2008 to refer to the special status that the stories of returning combatants who had felt war on their skin acquired in the early 20th century. He was specifically talking about the First World War. My own use of the term, however, expands flesh witnessing to encompass all forms of digital testimony recorded by those who risk their bodies in conflict zones today. For unlike in the past, where soldiers and war correspondents were the only flesh witnesses in the battlefield, today the landscape of testimony has changed. Today, civilians, NGOs, militants, terrorists, trolls, as I said earlier, refugees, and others also claim the news scene, increasingly defining the content of news from those parts of the world. The passages in the Mediterranean, the coast of Turkey, the camps in Jordan, the cities of Syria and Yemen, in Libya, and And so all of them have a say about what is going on and how we can watch it. At the heart of this transformation is, as Patrikarakos reminds us, and I quote now, the extraordinary, I'm not sure if I have this quote, I think. The extraordinary ability, is this the quote? Yeah. Yes. The extraordinary ability of social media to endow ordinary individuals with the power to change both the physical battlefield and the discourse around it. So this is what the rationality of flash witnessing is about, right? So I have now reviewed both major rationalities, convergence on the one hand, the dominant one, the debates about power, about truth that take place there, and then I also touched upon the rationality of flash witnessing, which is an alternative, not dominant, but implicit rationality in our engagement with user-generated content. And so having kind of completed that review, in this last part of my talk, I would like to focus on the challenges that this rationality of flash witnessing raises in contemporary journalism. What it does is that it both respects and interrupts the rationality of convergence and this kind of suspicion, constant suspicion about everything and about the truth of everything, and particularly constant suspicion towards the many voices of crisis and conflict. Flash witnessing, the rationality of flash witnessing, I want to argue, does not suggest that we a priori treat user-generated content as testimonial of somebody's genuine suffering. We cannot do that. That would be naive. But it suggests something different. It suggests that we open up the space where we come to understand flash witnessing as a rationality in its own terms, that it involves its own power relations, that it somehow is part of the ways in which, whether we like it or not, we shape, or news institutions shape, the ways in which we engage with conflict reporting and with mobile phone footage from conflict reporting. It's about recognizing that this space exists, bringing it into light, and then trying to reconstruct the kind of critique that I showed earlier in the 3 points that I presented to you about the rationality of convergence. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask the same question to the rationality of flash witnessing. What are the power relations and struggles that shape the testimonial potential of user-generated content in our media environment? And so here are the 3 points that I would like to, the 3 themes, if you like, through which we might be able to understand the rationality of flash witnessing. They will become all much clearer once we get into the examples. I'm starting with invisibility. On May 14th of this year, The Guardian reported that 85,000 children died of starvation in Yemen since 2016. There is user-generated content from Yemen, but it rarely becomes viral. And of course, it never becomes front-page news. It simply does not meet the criteria of Western newsworthiness. So invisibility, the invisibility of user-generated content from particular parts of the world is here less a technological problem, mobile phone exists there as well, and more, perhaps, that's the hypothesis I'm offering, a geopolitical one, insofar as the remediation of conflict depends on the strategic interests and security priorities that journalism serves. In other words, user-generated content may offer the potential for testimonials of atrocity, yet it rarely challenges the power relations of Western journalism. Everybody has a mobile phone, and they can film everything. But what comes through, what is remediated, is already entangled in existing hierarchies of global broadcasting. And this, in turn, reflects broader hierarchies of geopolitical relations and the powers of the West and its geopolitical interests in relation to the rest of the world. So the question of remediation is not just a technological one. What invisibility in the rationality of witnessing tells us is that it is also a political, a geopolitical problem. Of course, there are exceptions. For instance, the global scandal against the US military after the leak of the Abu Ghraib amateur images back in 2004. But as long as historical hierarchies of place and human life remain in place, such scandals will always be fleeting and fragmented rather than capable of challenging what we might call the global order. So if invisibility is the first kind of critical item of an agenda for understanding the rationality of flesh witnessing, skepticism is another. User-generated content, as we all know, is treated with a profound sense of suspicion. For instance, Bana al-Abed, a 7-year-old girl who, with the help of her mother, tweeted from Aleppo during the deadly siege of 2016, dominated Western news, not mainly because of her dramatic messages, but importantly because of the controversy around her authenticity. Who is she? What interests does she represent? Even when her account was actually verified through geolocational technologies and others, armies of trolls and individual users kept undermining the account's credibility and authenticity. Such cases of uncertainty, as Convergence argues, render flesh witnessing an unstable message and in need of constant reiteration and constant re-verification. So user-generated content news then becomes more about proving one is real as much as reporting the atrocity that that footage is trying to communicate. So this is the second kind of, if you like, implication of user-generated content as testimony with the kind of power structures of global media. And the third one is introvertedness. And introvertedness is about the priority that our media always offer to stories that are about us rather than distant others. In our LSE study on the 2015 migration crisis, for instance, we focused on the case study of the refugee selfie. And we explored how refugee selfies were remediated in European news, institutional news, in 9 nations across Europe, in Eastern and Central Europe. The key finding of that study is that not a single face of a refugee selfie appeared in our news. News images represented the act of selfieing, of them taking selfies, like this one, where the focus is on look at them doing it, either as a bad thing or a good thing. On politicians and the Pope, posing with them, so the focus is really on internal politics and our people. And then the focus is on celebrities who pose as migrants, as refugees, right? It is a kind of the glamorous actresses that enact the refugee with a kind of thermal blanket. So here there's no attempt, not only no attempt, there is a kind of active obstruction to meeting the face of these others, let alone to listen to their voices and stories or attend to their perspective. However, there is a story where we can see the refugee or the migrant in a kind of direct face confrontation, a direct face-to-face encounter with them. And the story, published at the BBC, was a story about refugee selfies as being fake. And indeed, that's a story where an actor posed as a migrant to document his dangerous journey to Europe, but that was part of a branding campaign for an SP advertising firm, right? So that's food for thought. Why is our only face-to-face encounter a story of fakeness? And we go back to suspicion. We go back to one of the three elements of the kind of power struggle between the rationality of witnessing and global broadcasting. So let me go back to the second question that I asked in the beginning of the lecture. Can user-generated content under these conditions really make a difference in the ways the news invites us to engage with conflicts and crises? Can it make a difference? Invisibility, skepticism, and introvertness, I argue, are manifestations of a particular practice of power that governs the circulation of such content in Western news. In journalism studies, the term we use for that is gate watching, right? Western journalists gate watch and kind of push out whatever is not relevant or interesting. But it makes perhaps more sense to call those power relations of the rationality of flesh witnessing practices of bordering rather than gate watching. The term bordering traditionally refers to military practices of power that keep migrant flows outside Western zones of safety and prosperity to keep us safe. By using the term bordering to talk about how the news excludes or restricts remediations of user-generated content, I want to highlight the geopolitical logic of security that regulates not only territories, but also institutions. Such practices of bordering, diverse and nuanced as they are, do not leave much space for the rationality of flesh witnessing, for testimonials of the flesh, the voices of precarious bodies to be heard and attended to in the news spaces of our liberal communities. So even though these communities are historically informed by the principles of humanitarianism and human rights, by what philosopher Richard Rorty calls a culture of sympathy, these principles are employed selectively. Invisibility, skepticism, and introvertness, as I said, consistently eclipse, resist, or appropriate those others and their testimonial in the news. So what I tried to do today then, and let me recap here, is that I mapped out the two rationalities that inform the debates on user-generated content in the news, convergence and flesh witnessing. And I showed that unlike the rationality of convergence, which was initially celebrated and later critiqued, and where terminology is both a problem and a solution, the rationality of flesh witnessing is silenced, implicit, and never talked about, never even acknowledged in our academic or public discourse. It is constantly rendered irrelevant, invisible, or suspicious. So while we allow the first to raise urgent questions about the nature of our liberal democracies, we do not pay attention to the second, to the latter. And when we do it, we only acknowledge it as a fleeting moment of heartbreaking pity, like the Aylan Kurdi, or political outrage, as for those of you who remember, the Abu Ghraib images. But they never become a kind of integral part of how we debate our democracy. So my aim in this lecture, then, is not really to moralize the news or news practitioners or to propose a revolution in the paradigm of news production, because both would be out of place. My aim has been rather to shift our perspective, even momentarily, even in the space of this lecture, and to help us imagine a way of thinking about, conceptualizing, and managing user-generated content in the news, in our public sphere, away from the rationality of convergence, and within an ethico-political framework of witnessing. Flash witnessing, I argued, alerts us to user-generated content no longer just as content, but as bodies reaching out, communicating their predicament. And, and here are, how can we, okay, thank you. Did I do it?
Yeah, let's go back.
Yeah, okay, I'm going to leave it here. So these are three questions. I do not want to read them out. They're posed in a kind of counter-distinctional mode. So it's this or the other that we might want to reflect on. Perhaps I should read that. It's important that we read them out, isn't it? Should the producers of war testimonials be treated as content, or as journalists who risk their lives to provide major Western news with stories and images of the battlefield? Sorry, no, this is not it, is it? I'll just come here and read it. Should the producers of war testimonials be treated as content or as journalists who risk their lives to provide major Western news with stories and images of the battlefield? Should remediation sustain its current practices of bordering? If so, how can it balance verification and security with the ethical and political concern of listening to others? Should news organizations go beyond the economy of attention and offer space and time for more contextual, historicized, and personalized pieces on conflict and its journalism and its journalists? So these are really the three questions that I would like to leave you with. If these proposals appear too idealistic or even irrelevant in the context of convergent news that we are living through and experiencing in our public life today, perhaps we need to remember that it is the void of a sustained culture of empathy, humanity, and inclusion that breeds the worst kind of anti-democratic populist rhetoric in our communities, in Europe and the US. And it is precisely the power of bordering, territorial but also narrative bordering, as the examples that I showed today demonstrate, that such authoritarian populism wants today to nurture and reproduce. The wall with Mexico and the Brexit saga are only two, perhaps the most prominent consequences of the rationality of convergence and truth over testimony. To go back to my introduction, we have now seen that the relationship between media and society is technological, it is economic, yes, and it is geopolitical. I hope, however, that in the spirit of Paul Attallah, I have also shown that this relationship is indeed primarily moral. At a moment in time when so much is at stake, critiquing the dominant rationalities that marginalize or erase the ethical core in our media is, I believe, a crucial intellectual task as scholars of communication and journalism. Thank you very much.